is a hit indie game with fast-paced face-offs between the most athletic robots you've ever seen, along with the entire afterlife in Dante's Inferno, and despite taking place in a supposed place of eternal suffering, most of this place isn't really that terrible, which begs the question, could you survive Ultrakill? And I don't mean as V1, I'm talking about you, the person watching this video, like in a survival situation. Sure, there are weapons scattered throughout the layers, and sure, Limbo has water in every individual level, but have you ever stopped and thought about whether a normal human could actually get to that water? Well, I did, and though the layers of this palace may look like they're about to eat you alive, fear not, because I have scoured through every level looking at every nook and cranny in order to find out how survivable each one would be, and then ranked them based on just how long you would be able to survive before getting Ultrakilled to death. And of course, we're going to need to lay down some ground rules in this survival situation. 1. When we enter a level, we are not allowed to leave that level under any circumstances, meaning that if you spawn in a giant desert, you'll need to figure out how to not be turned into a dried up twig under the sun in order to survive. And 2. We're spawning into the level outside the start elevator with nothing but the clothes on our back and the materials we have access to, except in the boss levels, but I'll get to that. And finally, we'll assume that with a weapon, we'll be able to defeat every enemy in the level with enough patience and planning. However, without a weapon, we won't be able to take down many enemies before we bite the dust, maybe 10 tops. And with our rules out of the way, let's get on to our first level with Heart of the Sunrise. Heart of the Sunrise is a lovely subsection in the layer of Limbo with several sources of water, many infinitely burning fires, and other luxuries that will help us survive. And not only that, but hopefully thrive. Upon spawning in outside the elevator, we're met with a fountain of water, and although it might seem like there is a limited supply here, there are actually constant drops that fly off. And no matter how long you wait in front of the fountain, the water will never run dry, meaning this early into the challenge, we have already found one of the most important things to help us survive, that being an infinite supply of fresh water. However, if we want to survive, we're gonna have to find a source of food as well, and luckily there's something here that will help us with that. The enemies in Ultrakill are very clearly flesh and blood, and with the abundance of enemies throughout these levels, we could hypothetically defeat them and use them for food. That is, as long as we have a weapon. In this room later in the level, we're able to pick up a nail gun that infinitely resupplies itself with ammo, which I don't actually know how that's possible, and whether or not that would possibly cover the room in nails such to the point that we slowly get buried by them. However, with this weapon, we should be able to take down any enemies in this level that might give us problems, but there's a slight issue of reaching it in the first place. After picking up this red skull and placing it on the pedestal to move further into the level, we're met with our first challenge, being alleged that V1 can easily hop over. However, an ordinary human cannot just jump 10 feet in the air, so we're gonna have to calculate how tall this actually is in order to determine if a human could reasonably climb over. Using debug mod, we can spawn in enemies, which despite not having canon heights, still have estimated heights online, and with V2's height being estimated at around 1.75 meters tall or 5 foot 9 inches, we can reasonably guess that your ordinary person would be able to either jump and pull themselves up this almost 10-foot ledge, or just use the resources nearby to get up in another way, which means that we can get into the next room. And upon entering, we're met with a beautiful waterfall and a stunning scenery with these pillars and this statue. However, this is also the first room in the level that has enemies. This is an issue as we haven't made it to our first weapon yet. However, like I said earlier, we can probably take down around 10 enemies before we ourselves bite the dust. And luckily for us in this first room, there is only 6 enemies for us to take on. However, since they're these drone enemies, they usually are just a little too far away to hit, but with a long enough stick in hand, we should be able to knock these enemies out of the sky and move on to the next room. Slight problem, the next room has 9 more enemies that spawn, which is way over the 10 enemy limit, and no matter how hard you look for shortcuts, there isn't exactly another way to the nail gun. However, Hakita, the creator of Ultrakill, was generous enough to make it so that you don't have to kill every enemy in certain rooms, meaning you can kind of just walk past all the enemies and get your hands on the nail gun, which means now we have a means of taking down the rest of the enemies in this level. And with an infinite supply of fire, we very well could turn every enemy in the level into some form of jerky if we cut these enemies into thin enough pieces, which given the supplies could very well be doable, which if our jerky perfectly preserves the meat on these guys, this will allow us to survive until all our food runs out instead of having to worry about whether it will spoil or not. Now it's it's kind of unclear whether or not the drone enemies are edible, as although they, along with other machines, are shown to have organs upon defeat, it's unclear exactly how much edible mass they have. So because of that, I won't be factoring them or almost any enemy type besides husks into my calculations. Husks are stated in their terminal entries to be human souls that formed bodies here, and although it's kind of unclear whether or not eating the product of human souls is cannibalism, we're gonna assume that these bodies have the same nutritional and caloric value as a normal human body, because that's what would make the most sense, and it kind of makes this survival situation the easiest, so we're gonna roll with that. There are several different types of husks that I will bring up when we meet them, but for this level, the only husks we have are filth, strays, and schisms. Filth are stated as human souls that failed to form a complete physical body, which means that their body mass is going to be less than a human, which I'm going to say is probably around half an average human's weight, or around 70 to 75 pounds, or 31.7 to 34 kilos. Strays are stated to be pretty tall, and with our height estimations for each enemy, this stands true as they are roughly 2.2 meters or 7 feet 2 inches. However, the stray is extremely skinny, and so presumably each stray has around the same body mass of a normal person, being at around 140 to 150 pounds or 63.5 to 68 kilos. Lastly, the schism is stated to form when two human souls try to make a physical body in the same place, which means that this probably has the body mass of two average humans at 280 to 290 pounds or 127 to 131.5 kilos. Since level 1-1 has 24 filth, 27 strays, and 6 schisms, that means there's approximately 7,407 pounds of food, or around 3,360 kilos, and although you would normally calculate the amount of calories from fat, it really doesn't seem like the enemies here are going to have any of that, so we're going to assume that all the body composition that would normally be from fat is instead going to be part of the skin, blood, and other edible mass that would normally comprise only around 40% on average, meaning we instead have 55% of our body composition coming from that, with around 30% coming from muscle and the rest of the body being comprised of inedible material like bone. And with around 188 calories per pound of non-muscle and nearly 700 calories per pound of muscle, we get 2,321,353 calories from the enemies in this level, which at 2,000 calories per day is going to be around 3.2 years before you run out of food, meaning this level is temporarily survivable. And this is a great baseline for our survival challenge, as it teaches us almost everything necessary that we might need to do to survive in these next levels, such as 1-2, the Burning World. 1-2, just like the previous level in Limbo, has a bountiful supply of water in a room a little ways into the level, and along with that provides us with a large amount of fire. In fact, a very, very large amount of fire. And along with that, there's also a room that contains lava that could be an excellent place to create jerky out of the meat of the enemies that we face in here. However, although everything we really need to survive this level temporarily is here, there is a glaring issue in the fact that we don't have a weapon in this level, meaning that if we want to reach any of this, we're gonna have to avoid triggering unskippable encounters with enemies. And as you might have guessed, the second room that we encounter already has an unskippable encounter, and that's kind of before we really have access to any fresh water, and not only that, but there are more enemies that we can take on without a weapon. That is, if we could even get there in the first place, because in order to reach the second room, you have to trigger enemies in the first room and somehow get up to this ledge before they kill you. And even if there weren't any enemies here, I'm pretty sure the water supply is radioactive, so it probably isn't safe to drink either way. Death by dehydration in 72 hours max. But don't let that distract you from the wonderful area of 1-3 Halls of Sacred Remains. This level is somewhat complicated as it has two paths for you to choose from, and while one of the paths is quite clearly a death trap, the other is not as terrible, as we have access to fresh water behind this Maurice, which it's a funny name that you probably shouldn't question, but regardless, this Maurice is the only thing blocking us from getting to water. And luckily, we don't even need to fight him because we can kind of just walk on past through the doorway, but we need to be careful not to go too far into the room since the enemies will trigger if we do. This shouldn't be a big issue as long as you aren't being done, and once you've gotten some water, you can backtrack to this door, which has some enemies behind it, being a machine that we can't eat and two schisms that we can. And just beyond this room, we have a room filled with lava, meaning that we can turn these enemies into jerky along with the 4 filth that we have to defeat when in the room, while also requiring us to defeat a drone. And although that's only 8 enemies so far, or 9 If you decided to defeat the Maurice for some reason, we can't actually go any further without triggering at least 6 enemies, so we're gonna have to survive exclusively on 2 schisms and 4 filth, which is not a whole lot to survive off of, as it gives us 872 pounds of food or 395.5 kilos, which converted to calories is only 273,284 calories, or at 2,000 calories per day, lets you survive just about 4.5 months until you run out of food. However, that does mean that this level is also temporarily survivable, unlike our next level, 1-4. Clair de Lune is a lovely song that was created in 1890 by Claude Debussy, which, when translated to English, means moonlight. And this magnificent piece of music is one of the most popular songs in history, and hopefully this is a song you like a whole lot, because it's all you're going to be hearing while trying to survive in this level. While the song plays eternally in the background, you will have the opportunity of exploring this entire place, reading the tale of one like you who was trapped in this place, writing to the angel Gabriel about how the endless tormenting of the music drove him insane, presumably being the skeleton here, which we'll name Hank, but unfortunately Hank isn't the only one keeping you company around here, as there's a machine that's roaming the halls of this place, and it's looking for blood. This is V2, which is the first real boss that Ultrakill has us take on, and although I would say that we wouldn't be able to take on a literal boss without a weapon, there is a terminal just before the boss arena that's willing to give you weapons in this level, so I'm gonna say that all weapons are allowed in this and all other boss levels, as it makes the challenge a little bit more fun. But even with these weapons letting you keep V2 from stealing your blood, you're not going to survive very long, as although there's an infinite supply of water from this waterfall, you don't exactly have any sources of food throughout this entire level, and therefore are going to be surviving it for a month max before dying of hunger. Though listening to Clair de Lune on max volume anywhere I go would probably make me clock out long before then. However, that brings us to our next layer with the layer of lust was originally ruled over by King Minos, who sought to free his people from the torment that they were forced to endure, and although it would have been an idyllic location back when King Minos ruled over it, it isn't anywhere close to that former glory, as after starting a renaissance across the entire layer, King Minos was slain by Gabriel, and now his corpse views the entire layer like some sort of all-seeing eye overhead. But all that doesn't mean that these levels aren't still completely habitable. 2-1 Bridge Burner has a large amount of water in the first room, and with no enemies guarding us from partaking, it would seem like this is a wonderful area for us to live. However, there's a slight problem, being that no normal human can make the leap from the first area to any of the platforms above. Now, there is a possibility that you could somehow push over one of these lampposts as a makeshift bridge to get up to this area. However, with several enemies firing at you and more than 10 enemies before reaching anything significant to store or preserve your food, in this level you are dying of hunger in a little over a month. But the next level is actually rather promising. 2-2 Death at 20,000 volts is a level that not only has water and enemies that we could turn into food, but also has a weapon in the form of the rail cannon. A weapon that basically is a coughing hydrogen bomb, which is a great weapon. However, you'd have to be careful not to accidentally activate it, as it is pretty destructive. However, in order to get this weapon, we first need to destroy these 3 breaker boxes, which seems like a difficult task at first glance. Each time we break a breaker box, try saying that 5 times fast, there are several enemies that will spawn, and since the rail cannon isn't given to us until later in the level, we have no ways to deal with these enemies at the moment, and we don't exactly have a great way to reach this breaker box up on top of the roofs here. But with a source of water, we have a month to figure out a way to either break through the door or activate all 3 breakers at once, so that we can kind of just run through the door and avoid all the enemies, which I think is a pretty doable task. And luckily enough, throughout this entire level, we don't have any rooms where we're required to defeat enemies, which means that if we run past all the enemies and don't look back until we reach the railgun, we can use our newfound equivalent of a hydrogen bomb to defeat any enemies that we might encounter. And with several sources of infinite fire here, we will have the opportunity to turn these enemies that spawn into jerky, which leaves us with a question of how much food do we actually have here? This level introduces us to the soldier enemy, and the terminal entry for them states that they're just an altered version of strays, meaning that we can expect them to be around the same amount of body mass, or in other words, we're just going to count them as the exact same amount of food as a stray would provide us with. With 8 filth, 7 strays, 1 schism, and 23 soldiers in the level, we have around 5,224 pounds of food, which if we turn all of it into jerky to preserve it, it will roughly give us around 1,637,201 calories of food, or just around 2.25 years worth before we run out. Which means that this is another level which is temporarily survivable. However, the next level under the all-seeing eye of Minos is not so forgiving, which is 2-3 Sheer Heart Attack. This level has water almost immediately, and although that may seem like a good sign, the last level that started out with water went nowhere pretty quickly. Luckily this time we have a way to actually progress into the next part of the room, however this is about where our luck starts to run out. See, there are less than 10 enemies here, and although that sounds great, we actually have a problem because although we could make jerky in previous levels to preserve our meat, in this level there's no way to actually accomplish this as there's no fire whatsoever. 1-2 really isn't looking all that bad right now. However, even if you could somehow get a fire going, the entire level is covered in water and presumably is humid enough that drying up the enemies would not be possible. So with a count of only 5 enemies that we can eat, since the human body can only absorb around 4 times more calories than it needs per day, with the meat most likely spoiling within the first day, we would only realistically have 20 more days to live before we died of starvation. But despite our lack of success on the other levels in the second layer, the next level we have is a boss level. And that means we will have access to every weapon that we've unlocked to this point, hopefully letting us survive a little longer. 2-4 Court of the Corpse King has us fight the corpse of King Minos. You know, the guy that's kind of the all-seeing eye that wants us to die? Yeah, well, we have to face this behemoth of a boss, being the tallest boss that we get to face in this entire game, or actually maybe the second tallest, but despite that, there's a few things that will help us survive here. For starters, there's a limitless supply of water dripping from the ceilings throughout the level, and along with that there's this pool of water in the boss arena that will allow us to satiate our hydration needs. So now all we have to do is find some food, and boy do I have good news for you, as this giant is going to supply us with all the food we could ever want. The corpse of King Minos is incredibly large, with some estimates placing him at around 280 meters tall and others saying he's 22 kilometers tall, which I don't think that's the case. There's no way that this is 22 kilometers. However, even if we lowball his height at just around 280 meters, the volume increase to him from a normal human is extremely large, being quite a lot over 2 million times the volume of a normal human, which would bring the total amount of mass that he has to around 391 million pounds or 177 million kilos. And assuming his body composition actually does have fat, since Minos is not like regular souls, we can estimate that his total caloric value is above 405 billion calories, or at 2,000 calories per day, over 555,000 years worth of food. However, that is only if we could properly store it for that long, and I don't think that's going to be possible considering the corpse is already dead when we kill it for the second time, and the food inside is probably not safe to eat. And even if it was, we wouldn't be able to properly store any of it or turn any of it to jerky with the weapons we currently have, so the meat would probably all go bad in a day or so. However, if the meat didn't spoil, we would be living it large in the level for the rest of our lives. But I'm going to be putting it in the death by starvation category. Anyways, Gluttony is Ultrakill's third layer with some lovely moving walls and a whole lot of danger everywhere we step. However, these edible interiors will be very useful to us throughout these next 2 levels. In 3-1 Belly of the Beast, we have all the meat we could ever eat, as these moving walls are most likely alive and edible, and by the looks of it, there's a lot of meat to eat in this treat of a street, so now all we have to do is get some water. And that shouldn't be much of an issue, seeing as when we move through this door, we're greeted with a Maurice. But more importantly, we are greeted with a liquid, which to normal person might just look like blood. However, V1 does not get healed when walking through this liquid, so it's safe to assume it is something else. That's right, this is in fact a water pool, and although some of you are probably saying that this might not be safe to drink, I think for the sake of making this challenge more interesting, we'll at the very least say it might be safe to drink. Now, this water pool is definitely not infinite and might very well not be enough to keep us alive in this level, so let's do the the measurements on this thing. After defeating this Maurice, we can see that this water pool is around the width of his head, which, using some estimates online for how large a Maurice head is, we can determine that this pool of water is around 175 centimeters wide, and after doing some simple photoshopping, we can also determine that it is roughly 1,575 centimeters long. I wasn't sure exactly how deep it was, but considering it doesn't reach anywhere close to the top of the fallen Maurice's head, I will say the water pool is around only 20 centimeters or so tall, which, when we multiply all that together to find the total volume of the water pool, we find that there's around 5.5 million cubic centimeters of water, or 1,456 gallons, which at a gallon a day would last us only around 4 years before we die, and that would be where this ended if it weren't for another room that has this watery substance. Initially, I was worried that we wouldn't be able to reach this because there's a room full of enemies that we would have to clear in order to get there, and we only had 9 enemies left if we decided to defeat the Maurice from earlier. However, this room, luckily enough, only has 9 enemies for us to defeat, so we just barely make the 10 enemy limit. Now, the jump down to the room looks scary at first, however, considering these mouths open up without any problems and there's easily enough water to catch you so you don't receive bodily injuries, so long as you don't walk too far towards the doorway leading out of here, you should be able to stay in this room indefinitely without concern of food or water. Which means that this is the first level of Ultrakill that is perpetually survivable, and when things are looking up, you just know that everything is going to come crashing down in an instant. 3-2 in the flesh has us in another meaty room, and this would help us immensely with our survival if we actually had access to water. First off, there's no way that you're actually getting out of this room to the rest of the level, and it's not like actually going to the rest of the level is going to help you since there isn't water there either. Now, there is this liquid dripping from the ceiling, and look, normally I would say that this could possibly be water since it made the challenge more interesting, but its consistency looks more to be like saliva or some other liquid like that, so as much as I would like to say that this might hydrate you, it probably isn't going to. Best case scenario, you're dying in 72 hours if you get put here, which is pretty unfortunate after the last level's success. So 4-1 Slaves to Power. I really like this level. There's a pyramid in the background, a nice little water pool that you can get to, and a whole lot of sand. This is obviously a pretty difficult spot to try to survive in because of the heat from the sun, and without water, this place would be pretty rough. However, we're able to make it to this water pool after taking out exactly 10 enemies and survive until we die of hunger. However, that is assuming that this water pool doesn't evaporate in a couple days in this heat, because if that happened, we would likely die of dehydration, but I'm going off the fact that the water never evaporates in the game, so we're gonna assume it will do the same for us. And though we would still die from the heat under normal circumstances, we could just dunk ourselves in the water whenever we're overheating. Assuming that these filth we took on earlier could possibly be turned into jerky with the hot dry weather, we might be able to temporarily survive in this place for a few more months than we would have with just the water pool. Basically, we got our own private desert resort, watching the pyramid while sitting in our lovely pool of water for the rest of our days. However, our next level 4-2 is not so fortunate. The moment we spawn into this level, we are met with the unfortunate fact that touching the hot sand is almost an instant kill, as these filth die the second they touch it. And although we would presumably spawn in with shoes, they wouldn't help us here. There's literally no water throughout the entire level, and considering the heat is enough to immediately kill filth on impact, I'm guessing that those shoes wouldn't really help us be protected from the sun, so yeah, you're dying in less than 72 hours due to the extreme heat in the best case scenario. What kind of dark situations we keep getting put into. But not as dark as our next level, 4-3, A Shot in the Dark. This level has water, fire, and food for us to obtain, and although I would ordinarily say that you wouldn't be able to make it to the water as the enemy count is well above 10 and you don't technically have a weapon, I'm gonna stretch the definition of a weapon here to make things interesting. At the start of the level, you're given a torch, and although you wouldn't ordinarily think of this as a weapon, and although this double weapon orb doesn't double the torch, and although this alone really shouldn't be able to defeat all these enemies, we're gonna take advantage of the fact that torches light enemies on fire, as this slowly removes their health for as long as they're burning alive. This is fine. And using this knowledge, we could use this to light the enemies in the first section on fire, and after they're defeated, we could gather any flammable materials to start a fire in the room with a whole lot of enemies, which although there doesn't seem to be much at first, we still have the bodies of the enemies we defeated, and I've checked, you can relight them on fire even after they're put out, and for some reason their texture doesn't change, so we could use that to cause nearly all the enemies in this room to light on fire until they're defeated, and from there do the exact same in any rooms with enemies until we get to the room with water. Yes, it's extremely convoluted and probably in practice wouldn't work out very well. However, we're gonna assume that it could technically be pulled off here if you were really cautious about how you played it. Now, how much water do we actually have? Well, I did some measurements using our fallen Maurice as a basis and estimated that the volume of this pool of water is roughly 10.5 million cubic centimeters of water, or 2,775 gallons. However, that was before I realized that there's more to this water pool. In fact, there's a vent here which doesn't have a specified end. However, even if there was a specified end, there is water constantly dripping from the ceiling, meaning that this water supply is never gonna run out. So now our only issue is food. In this level, there are 6 filth, 5 strays, 10 schisms, 21 soldiers, and 3 new husk enemies called stalkers, which we probably can't eat since they kamikaze as soon as they get close to almost anything, so we're gonna say that stalkers aren't gonna add to our food supply, but with the other enemies, we're looking at around 7,108 pounds of food, which could be turned into jerky with our source of fire, and assuming the jerky doesn't go bad, we'll have roughly 2.2 million calories, or at 2,000 calories per day, just around 3 years worth of food, making this level temporarily survivable. But that brings us to our last level of greed with 4-4 Clair de Soleil. Clair de Soleil is a reference to Clair de Lune, a previous level from Limbo, in which you would ordinarily take on V2 in a battle. However, just like before, we're not going to do that, and instead look at our survival options. Since this is a boss level, we're gonna have access to all the weapons that we've collected thus far. However, there is a slight issue of these jump pads. These things are extremely dangerous. Like, just watch how fast you get flung upwards. These things would not only cause you to die from the G-forces being applied to your body, but you would almost certainly hit your head on the top of the ceiling. However, because it would be boring and lame to not be able to go any further into the level just because of a jump pad which makes literally 0 sense, we're gonna say that instead these jump pads just teleport you to the top, because why on earth would they just yeet things into the stratosphere at Mach Infinity? It makes literally 0 sense. Anyways, at the top of these giant elevators are ropes that you could use to climb back down if needed, since there isn't a teleportation pad on this side, and with that, we have access to not a whole lot, I'm gonna be honest. There is an area with a broken bridge that you could get to, though there's not much of a way to get to the other side, and even if you could, there's no source of food available down that path. However, there is another door to the right that can only be opened when this skull gets taken off this pedestal. However, without the grapple arm, you would have to find another way to accomplish this. With the disposal of skeletons and the rope from the first elevator that we won't need to use anymore, we could hypothetically tie these all together, acting similar to the grapple arm, except for it would just push the skeleton skull off the pedestal to obtain the water, and since we have access to weapons, we can actually use this water to access more of the level. Using the rail cannon to electrify this water opens up this door to a saw blade launcher to add to our arsenal, along with a giant body, which is presumably the body of Sisyphus. Although this thing is not nearly as large as Minos' body was, Sisyphus's body is bound to have plenty of food for us as long as we can reach it, which shouldn't be too difficult a task. With our newfound saws from our saw blade launcher, we can connect a few of these to the long pole that we made from the skeletons earlier, and using that we should be able to reach over and cut a slice off of Sisyphus each time we get hungry, which begs the question of how many calories would Sisyphus be providing? Since his body is in a hot, dry place, we're gonna assume that he's already perfectly preserved, and considering how his body doesn't have any signs of rot, this should be a safe assumption, so let's figure out how tall this guy is. Using the spawner arm to summon in Maurice's, we can determine that Sisyphus's body is roughly 24 Maurice heads tall on his torso, which, with the Maurice head's height being estimated to be 1.77 meters, means that Sisyphus's torso is roughly 42.48 meters. Now, an average human torso is around half a meter, meaning that Sisyphus's torso is 84 times taller than an average human. That would mean that the volume increase from a normal human to him is slightly less than 600,000 times more. However, with only the torso of Sisyphus, it's likely to be closer to 400,000 times more, and since weight scales proportionally with volume, Sisyphus is going to come in at around 72.5 million pounds, or at around 32.8 million kilos. Which would be nearly 75 billion calories, or at 2,000 calories per day, around 102,000 years worth of food. Meaning that if we boil any water that we lose from our body to turn it back into drinkable water forever, we would be able to perpetually live in level 4-4. But since the water we have is probably going to be difficult to keep around until we die of old age, I'm going to put this down as only temporarily survivable, with the likelihood of it being perpetually survivable for someone who knows what they're doing. But with that finished, we're going on to the next layer with Wrath is an extremely interesting layer with some of the least survivable levels that you've ever seen. For starters, 5-1 in the Wake of Poseidon starts us out in a cave, and although it seemed like not a bad place since there's water, there's a slight issue in the fact that we can't exactly get out of this place without the grapple arm, and there isn't any food until later in the level. I mean, yeah, you could just technically climb out, but considering this entire cave is dripping water everywhere, I'm gonna guess that these walls would be pretty slick and slippery. But I don't know, maybe you're extremely strong and have grip strength so incredible that not even slippery walls can stop you from climbing across all this place. Well, great for you. It's not gonna help you at all, as after you get across, you will fall down this narrow passage into a room full of water, which you can't actually get back out the way you came, like some sort of space-time anomaly, meaning you're gonna drown. But there is a solution that will help us get rid of all that water, because if you break all these pipes and go back to that exact same place, you will have solved the problem of the room being filled with water. Slight problem, you solved the problem of the room being filled with water, meaning that when you fall into the room, instead of drowning, you will plummet to your death on the ground below. Meaning that no matter how you put this level, you're not surviving more than a month, and you would probably die earlier because wet caves are really cold, so you might die of hypothermia before that, but I'll be generous on this level. I won't, however, be generous in our next level, 5-2. 5-2 Waves of the Starless Sea has you starting out on the rainiest place I think I've ever seen, which is surprising because I've experienced a real-life typhoon. Early on into this level, there's going to be several jumps that you cannot make as a human. Yeah, good luck there. And since this level is very stormy, you're not going to be swimming anywhere in these waters. And although you won't be suffering any thirst because of the rain, you will actually be suffering much worse because of it, as without any protective gear of any kind in this weather, you're most likely going to succumb to the elements, meaning that you would have at most a few hours before hypothermia sets in. 5-3 Ship of Fools might seem like a good level at first. It has a weapon for us to pick up and water that we could use throughout this entire level, and of course several enemies that we could use as food should we need to, but the issue comes in how you would actually obtain the weapon in the first place. The rocket launcher, the weapon that we need to get to, is all the way on the opposite side of the ship, and without any way to actually get over there without encountering more than 10 enemies, we're gonna have to do with the space we have before exceeding that limit. Our first room has us face 6 enemies, with 2 of those being street cleaners and the other ones being the ones that we could eat. And there is a small amount of water here that will help us in our goals to survive, but how much water is there exactly? Using the spawner arm, we can find that it is roughly 1 Maurice wide and 4-ish Maurices long, and less than 1/10 of V2's height, which would mean that there's approximately 500-ish gallons in here if we don't factor in the statue that's taking up most of it. But realistically, it's probably like 150 gallons or so, and that would be plenty to starve to death in a month, since there's no way to preserve the enemy meat without potentially burning the entire ship down, so you're lasting a month tops here. But there is still 1 level left in Wrath for us to look at. 5-4 is a boss level that has us facing off against a mighty beast called the Leviathan, one capable of tearing through ships, shooting endless projectiles out of its mouth, and swiping at us with its tail. And although that might sound bad, there's something much worse that we're going to be dying of, since as soon as we spawn into this level, we are presumably going to be crushed to death by the weight of the water at these depths. However, assuming we don't get crushed immediately under the water pressure, we are likely going to drown due to it being nearly impossible to make it to the surface in time without having inhuman swimming speeds, making this one of the only levels where you will be ultra killed before you have any time to adjust to your situation. And with that, we move on to the next layer with... This layer is one of the worst places that you can be brought into, especially 6-1 Cry for the Weeper, as although I would normally give you 10 enemies before you bite the dust, this level may be an exception, as along with the aggressive sounds of microwaving throughout this level, you will also always be greeted with the sounds of yelling from the people being tormented here. And after more than an hour of that, I think I would cut it short, but even if you didn't, there's no available water anywhere in this level. So max, you're lasting 72 hours here, but the next level is not quite as bad. 6-2 Aesthetics of Hate is another boss level, and that means that you will have weapons at your disposal. Not that it's gonna help you since you can't leave this first section, but hey, it's not all bad. You do have quite the large amount of water, so you don't need to worry about dying from dehydration. However, you might have to worry about literally everything else because you probably aren't gonna be sleeping very well due to all the organ playing, just like Claire de Lune in Limbo, but realistically, not sleeping is not gonna kill you, as the worst that could happen is that you, pass out due to exhaustion and wake up in a couple days, so at the very least, you might be able to last a month until you die of starvation. But hey, that's better than dying of dehydration, and speaking of which... 7-1 Garden of Forking Paths has water, just you can't reach it without defeating more than 10 enemies first, and same with 7-3, but 7-2 just like how are you supposed to get past this without the grapple arm? Are you just supposed to crawl along the walls? I mean, these mannequins crawl along the walls, so maybe that's how you're supposed to do it, but how is anyone else supposed to? Also, I probably would die way earlier in 7-1 due to fear, because the moment you pick up this skull, these mannequins all suddenly just change positions behind you, and look, I normally handle jump scares kind of alright, but if this happened in real life, I am clocking out in an instant. Not to mention the next room. Yeah, I'm not dealing with that. I'm dying immediately. And speaking of dying immediately, 7-4 is one of the worst levels because you spawn in an active war zone with no materials to defend yourself with. And two giant machines are playing back and forth with literal lasers and mass destruction. So all of these levels at their best are probably just death by dehydration. No better case scenario for any of these. And although that is the last main level of the game, we actually skipped over the first 5 main levels in the game, so we're gonna put them here real quick. And although you might think I saved these levels because they're really cool, if you were paying attention when the first level was put up on the tier list, yeah, they're not great. 0-1 Into the Fire gives you 2 spawn points, and I will really only be talking about one of them because the other literally doesn't let you make it out of the second room. So in the other spawn point for 0-1, you're met with a long hallway that leads you to a gun, and after picking up the gun, you're met with many filth, which would normally be an issue, but since you have a gun, any and all enemies we encounter are able to be defeated here. And this level seems like it would be going really well so far, except there hasn't been a single source of water, and there isn't a single source of water throughout this entire level, meaning at best you would die of dehydration in 72 hours tops. 0-2 is a pretty bad level to be in. For starters, the name is the Meat Grinder, which already has a bad ring to it, and although you can make it to the first 2 rooms without killing any enemies, the third room has exactly 10 enemies that you're required to kill before you can move forward. Not that it really does you any good, but it does allow you to see a glimpse of the swords machine, a robot that's actively looking for the nearest source of blood, just like V2 and 1-4. This is a real problem because you're human and humans are made of blood, and unless the sword machine gives up his hunt for blood or gets far away enough that you wouldn't be detected, you're most likely getting caught at some point or another and becoming a source of fuel for the swords machine, meaning that you're probably gonna die much sooner than 72 hours here. But in the next level, you at the very least won't die to a swords machine looking for your blood, since in 0-3 Double Down down, you are dying due to dehydration in the first room. This, much like 1-2, has alleged that you as a normal human would not be able to jump to or reach in any way, shape, or form. And even if you could, there's no water throughout the entire level, so we have yet another level that has us dying by dehydration. But these next two levels are different. Not because they have water or anything like that, no, it's because they're so much worse. 0-401 Machine Army has us spawned into an area which is so hot that throughout the level we are forced to go into these cooling chambers and cool down before continuing onward, which presumably means this level is not just normal hot, but like actually hot to the point of it being concerning. And with no way to actually reach these cooling chambers before being forced into an encounter with more than 10 enemies, we are going to be dying much before 72 hours due to the heat, and the next level is not very different. 0-5 Cerberus has us spawn into a level where just beyond the first door is literal lava, and I'm gonna guess that would be just as hot as the previous level, so just like the previous level, I'm gonna say that you're dying much before 72 hours due to the heat. And with that, we have covered every main level of Ultrakill. However, there are quite a few levels that are not technically part of the main set of levels, requiring you to discover secrets in the main levels or requiring you to get a certain rank on all the levels before attempting them. And since they're part of the main game, you know that we just have to rank them all on survivability. So let's begin with our first secret mission, 0-S, which is by far one of the worst places in the entire game. 0-S, Something Wicked, has you start out in a strange looking area, semi-reminiscent of a subway station after hours, and although this level wouldn't be all that intimidating at first, it's not until after you pick up the blue skull that things start to become scary, as when you pick this up, a monster that will immediately kill you upon contact will spawn into the level, requiring you to run through this place to grab the red skull and place it on the pedestal near the end of the level to make it disappear. And although this is hypothetically manageable, I would give a normal human 50-50 odds on pulling this off without getting killed by the monster in this level, so I'm gonna put this one down as less than 72 hours just because of that. The next secret level, 1-S, named the Witless, has 0 food and 0 water, just a bunch of puzzles that you could theoretically do while counting down the 72 hours that you have left, and 2-S is interesting level, to say the least, and it's also interesting in our survival situation as we're probably in a town of some sort. Now, it's impossible to say exactly what this town might have to let us survive, as we don't really get a good look at it, instead being stuck with a V1 wannabe named Mirage. However, if this town has any sort of normalcy, then it would be reasonable to assume that we will be able to get all of our basic needs from it, with Mirage even saying that there are places to go get food. However, although this level could be one of the most survivable places on our list, it could also be that this is all a mirage, so to speak, because throughout this level we can't move at all, only being able to choose our dialogue options. And if we spawn in here just like this, unable to move a muscle except in the occasional speaking of our dialogue prompt, then we are doomed to die in 72 hours by dehydration. And since we don't actually see anything that could help us survive while playing this level, we're going to assume that us being completely unable to move is going to be the most likely scenario here, but going to 4-S, we're most likely going to long for the days where we couldn't move, because this is another desert level without water, so you're probably going to be dying from exposure to the sun much earlier than 72 hours here. However, 5-S is one of the most glorious locations this game has to offer us. When spawning into this paradise of a place, you are met with a simple landscape, a few various trees, a singular Cerberus statue, and a vast lake near a large ocean. To your right, there's a cozy cabin with a bed and some apples. Heck, there's even a chair to sit on and a shelf full of various bottles. And though the cabin doesn't have a closable door, that doesn't really bother you right now, because for the first time in this entire challenge, you don't really have to worry. In this glorious place, there is a relaxing waterfall on one side of the island, one that provides you with unlimited fresh water, and with this barrel magically refilling itself with apples, you won't ever have to worry about not having enough food. And with all the comforts of an ordinary 18th century home and a fire that never burns out, this island has everything you could ever need. And that's without even taking a look at the main mechanic of this secret level, that being the fishing. Throughout the settlement are various different fishing poles, and after grabbing one of these and heading to the docks, you can take that chair from your cabin and kick back and relax while you fish in the lake to meet your protein needs. And if you were ever feeling adventurous, you could use one of these smaller fish as bait to catch a shark from from the ocean. Now, most of these places might look familiar to you since I've been using them as a background for this video, and though the main reason is because these locations are some of the best looking in the entire game, the second reason is because this is by far the most habitable level of Ultrakill, dare I say, letting you thrive in your newly found fishing paradise. And of course, with the endless source of fresh water along with the seemingly infinite supply of apples and fish, this level goes straight to the top of the perpetually survivable levels in Ultrakill. Now, I don't want to linger on this level that has already been classified as perpetually survivable, but I do want to point out that this level still has dangers that you could encounter. For instance, fishing in the stream gives you a bomb fish, and although it never explodes while you're holding it, you would have to be careful not to accidentally drop it if you were near the housing area. And also, there's an area that has an eyeball constantly looking at you, though that isn't really inherently dangerous, though the only real harm that can fall upon you would be self-inflicted, meaning this is one of the most idyllic locations that I've ever seen a game create. And with that, let's look at 7-S. 7-S would seem like a great place, plenty of books to keep you from getting bored, plenty of water in the outside pool that's fueled by a waterfall for some reason, and a plethora of rooms for you to explore. However, the devil is in the details, and the details here would be death by dehydration, because you cannot make it to the water outside without being forced to defeat over 10 enemies, which leads us to the best secret levels in the game, Without overcomplicating things, the Prime Sanctums are the most difficult levels in the game of Ultrakill, besides the Encore levels, but we'll cover those in a minute, and each one is home to a Prime boss, P1 having Minos Prime and P2 having Sisyphus Prime, which might sound familiar as these two guys are this guy that we fought in the Lust layer, and this guy that we used to survive in 4-4 in the Greed layer, as after they died in the afterlife, their souls were powerful enough to form new bodies called Prime bodies, and thus their souls are referred to as Prime souls. These are the two toughest enemies in the entire game, however neither seems particularly hostile, at least not to humans, meaning that if they are freed then we probably would not have to worry about them attacking us. However, even if we did have to worry, we're gonna allow weapons in these levels since I did for all the other boss levels throughout the game, so with that, how well do we actually fare against the Prime Sanctums? P-1 Soul Survivor starts us out in a place pretty similar to the layer of Gluttony, with a fleshy floor and a singular torch for us to grab. However, even if we climb all the way down the spine of whatever this thing is, it's not going to help us since there is a large fall required to reach this bottom section. However, let's assume we somehow do make it down using some sort of rocket ride or something else to get us down safely. Is this going to help us? No, not really, since there's not any water in this entire level. However, there is one last hope, being Minos Prime. Since we're human, we probably wouldn't get attacked by Minos if we freed him, and though the flesh prison could pose a challenge for a normal human even with weapons, if we manage to get Minos out, then we could try negotiating with him to help us get all the resources necessary for our survival down here, and if he agrees, then we will be living at large down here. However, there is the slight chance he kind of just runs off to defeat the hosts of heaven, leaving us down here with nothing until we inevitably die of dehydration. So on the bright side, we could maybe survive perpetually here, but realistically we're going to dehydrate and therefore dihydrate down here, but that is not the case for our next level, P-2, because it's raining. Okay, I know the other level where it was raining was bad, but this level is actually a whole lot better. For starters, there are areas that are protected from the rain, and assuming we have weapons, we can take down the enemies throughout this level if we really needed to. However, Sisyphus, I mean, he might choose not to fight us, but considering he's known for starting a war, I don't think he would be as forgiving as Minos, and probably would want to start a battle immediately upon freeing him. Now, in a fair fight, I don't know if a normal human would actually be able to take down Sisyphus, but luckily both Sisyphus and Minos have one fatal weakness, in that they won't close their big stupid mouths. They both literally give a massive speech before the battle even begins, and they do it again after they lose as well, so I'm assuming that this would be the case if we had to fight Sisyphus as well, and although we can't damage Sisyphus during his monologue, we can set up quite a few traps to take him down, such as this saw blade trap, along with using our rockets that can freeze themselves themselves for a few seconds that after releasing themselves would deal extra damage as well, and with all that put together, we should be able to bring down Sisyphus with only minor difficulty, which brings into question, how many calories is this guy? And I actually have an answer for that since we already found the answer earlier in the video. In 4-4, we estimated that Sisyphus's body had 600,000 times the volume of a human body, but since he only had his torso, we cut that down to 400,000. But since this guy and that guy are the same guy, we can just assume that all of the calories that his previous body had would also be present in this new body, which isn't actually going to provide us with anything because this isn't technically a body, it's a soul taking physical form, meaning that after the soul dies, we aren't going to have anything to eat. And although we could eat some of the other enemies throughout P-2, there's no place to store or preserve any of the food that we receive. However, remember how I said the rain might be better this time? Well, I technically lied because this rain probably isn't even drinkable to begin with, as it's purely red, meaning that it probably isn't normal water, so we're likely dying from dehydration in one of the worst places in the game. And that brings us to the Encores are redos of entire layers that we have looked at previously, and though you might think that would just lead to the exact same outcome that we came across in those layers, you might actually be surprised about how survivable the Encores are compared to the actual levels. For starters, 0-E. 0-E, this heat and evil heat, starts out in a place completely frozen, and although I would normally say that we would have to find a weapon before being able to take on enemies, since these levels are supposed to chronologically take place after the original levels, I'm going to say that every weapon in the game has already been discovered, and also these levels have nothing going if we can't defeat the enemies in the level, so starting out we have quite a few serveri to deal with, along with a whole lot of cold ice. However, that isn't much of an issue since we have the ability to create fire with our rocket launcher, or at the very least a way to light this oil on fire, so if we get too cold we should be able to warm ourselves up without too many issues. This state of the facility is not all that bad, as all of the enemies that we defeat will immediately be preserved in the freezing cold temperatures we currently have. However, there's no way of telling whether this ice we have throughout the entire facility is actually ice or if it's possibly just solid nitrogen. Spoiler alert, it is just solid ice. I'm just doing this so that we'll get through the entire level and meet all the enemies. Anyways, after going through the level and placing both of the skulls on these pedestals, we discovered that those were the keys to powering up the entire facility, meaning that the stuff that was previously ice is now completely water, which is great. However, something that is not so great is the whole place is burning hot now, but luckily there are several of these things to cool us down, and although you might be saying that no human could realistically cross over any of these gaps to get to one of the cooling chambers, we're gonna assume that we made a way across while the facility was still frozen. Therefore, we're able to make it to the cooling chambers without too many difficulties, and we also will have the opportunity to gather water, as there is a room that has a plentiful amount. Enough that we'll never have to worry about water again. However, we do have to worry about food, as there is a limited supply here, or so it would seem. See, if you only calculated the edible enemies, then we would only have around 4,365 pounds of food. However, this level introduces radiant enemies, ones which have much more health and deal much more damage. And if this is the case, we can assume that this would nearly double the caloric value of the food, or if you want to keep things simple, just double the amount of food, meaning that we would have 8,730 pounds of food, which, if kept in the refrigeration units throughout the facility, would be enough to last us nearly 4 years. However, there is something that we could factor into our calculations here, that being this stuff, which I at first thought was just water. However, after realizing it was not anywhere near the color of water, I thought it might be blood, but considering it doesn't heal V1, it is more likely some sort of meat, which would make sense as this part of the Encore level matches up nicely with level 0-2, the meat grinders. So with that sorted out, we can say that we have an extra source of food that we could incorporate into our other food supply, and given that this thing kinda doesn't run out, we could safely assume that we won't run out of supply anytime soon. So with that, we can determine that the first Encore level is actually one of the only levels that is perpetually survivable, which brings us to our last actual level of the game. However, we still have one more area to talk about after that, but for now, let's focus on 1-E, then Fell the Ashes. To start out, we have almost nothing to go off of, requiring us to fight through dozens of rooms before even seeing our first water source as V1, which is the same waterfall from 1-4 that we used to survive infinitely. However, this isn't filled with water when we first get here, first we're required to activate this terminal, which although we technically can defeat all the enemies with the weapons we have, there is this room where the floor kind of just disappears, and so the whole room kind of just becomes a pit. So unless you're a pro at rocket riding and can manage to get through this room without falling into the giant fan below, I don't think you're gonna last much longer than 72 hours in here. However, just to be fun, I did the calculations to see how much food you would have after defeating all the enemies, and it's barely 3 months worth of food, assuming you use the lava room to turn it into jerky, so you aren't really doing much better in the best case scenario where you somehow survive the massive pit room, and that is the final of the actual levels. However, there is one more place in Ultrakill that we haven't talked about, that being the museum. Is a place dedicated to the fabulous development team and voice actors that helped make Ultrakill what it is today, having a monument to the creator RC Hikita Patala, having sections for the developers and artists, and having a statue of the CEO of New Blood Interactive, Dave Oshry. And throughout the museum, there are several fun activities like playing chess against the CPU, or spawning in a literal black hole, along with just relaxing in the courtyard or taking a stroll. But even though this isn't technically a completable level, I figured it would be a fun place to take a look at in our survival situation. And boy was I right. Starting off, there's a source of infinite water in this section just before entering the museum, and even if there wasn't, there are sinks to wash your hands with inside the museum, which presumably would give us water, and there's literally water just lying all over the floor, so we're gonna be good on fresh water here, and the only worry that we might have is going to be food. In the museum, there are several trees growing 3 coconuts each, which, using a Maurice as the base to find the coconut's height, we can see that each coconut is around a third of Maurice's head's height, making it just around 0.6 meters in diameter, which is absolutely enormous. Normal coconut's like around 0.2 meters in diameter, so these things have a much larger volume than a normal coconut, meaning more food for us. Though the caloric value should scale with volume, even if these coconuts were only to give us 3 times the food, since there are 20 of these trees with 3 coconuts each, we would have 60 coconuts, and since each normal coconut gives us 1400 calories, we would take that times 60 times 3 to get 252,000 calories, or just around 4.2 months worth of food. And if that were all that we had, then that wouldn't be very great, but fear not, because there's plenty more to bring to the table. For starters, we have 2 trees growing what seem to be apples, and judging by their red color, we are going to say these are based off of Red Delicious apples in real life. Each Red Delicious apple has around 110 to 130 calories, and with 8 that are available, it wouldn't even add an extra day to our stay here. However, presumably since these trees are based on real life trees, we can guess that they would grow fruit just like real life trees. However, in game we never get to see if that's the case, so let's talk about what we have to do if these coconuts and apples don't grow back. In the museum, there are these displays of enemies that we normally would face, and although we would normally eat the enemies, these displays actually don't have collision, almost like some sort of ghost or hologram. Now, I don't think normal people can eat holograms, and though you could argue that ghosts are edible as the prime souls technically could be counted as ghosts, I'm gonna say that these displays aren't going to be a viable source of food. And although there is another tree that looks to be growing the same thing that the Cerberus hold in their hands, these things are energy orbs, and according to the entry on the Cerberus, they are extremely difficult to keep stable, so basically if we took one of these things and accidentally dropped it, then finding a source of food would be the least of our concerns. So we're gonna have to look for an alternative source of nutrition, and luckily there is something that will allow us to perpetually survive here. In the courtyard, there's this fish tank, which on a completely new save file will have 10 fish inside, which isn't a lot, but fish have a unique ability to repopulate. Now we're gonna say these 10 fish are presumably trout, meaning that if they're old enough to lay eggs and the season is right, then we could get them to lay enough eggs to feed us while we wait for enough fish to reach the age that they could lay more eggs. However, that's gonna be a lot since we'll need to eat a lot of smaller fish before that time, so how many eggs are these fish actually going to have to lay, and more importantly, how many will they lay? Considering these fish are roughly the same length and therefore around the same height as a Maurice, we can say that these fish are on the larger end, meaning that they are going to lay a lot more eggs than the smaller ones would, each one laying up to as many as a few million in a full season, which would be around 3 months. Now we do have 4.2 months worth of coconuts that we can eat while we let these trout produce eggs, which means they would probably lay at the bare minimum 5 million eggs across all of them, which in the worst case scenario of only 1 or 2% of those hatching would still be 50,000 baby fish. But we are probably gonna have to eat a whole lot of those in order to survive until more fish can reach maturity in 1 to 2 years. Each of these small trout would be around 111 calories, with the calorie count going up as they mature, and assuming we eat the larger trout first, which are presumably at least a dozen kilograms, we should be able to avoid eating the smaller trout for at least a month or two, and after determining how long the little trout would actually keep us alive for, we are not going to have to worry, since even in the least optimistic scenario, those 50,000 fish are going to make a few hundred adult trout that can repopulate and make a perpetual source of food for us. Or if we wanted to avoid doing all those calculations, we could just say that we completed the fishing secret level, which puts all the fish that we caught there here instead, meaning that we could eat the great white shark looking one first, which when cut up with the saw blades for our weapons and dried up by a fire started by just putting a branch above this trash can before tossing one of these plush toys in, we should be able to preserve the meat and eat it for quite a while until all the other fish have produced enough eggs that the rest is history. But regardless of which way you put it, this level is going in the perpetually survivable tier, and that is every level in Ultrakill ranked on survivability. If you think that I misranked any of these levels, I would love to hear what you think their rank would be and why, and also if you would like to see more videos like this in the future. Before I close out this video, I would like to thank my channel members for contributing to this channel and supporting the videos, as it helps me keep this channel from becoming a pile of ash and debris. And with all that out of the way, if you enjoyed this video, YouTube itself thinks that you might enjoy this video as well, so consider watching it to see if they're right. And as always, this has been Epoch, your place for everything indie game related, and I hope I'll see you all in the next one.